I want to give a special shout out to all my patrons, my Bibliosprand, Bibliohowlers, and Bibliomancers. Thank you so much for supporting my hobby and passion even more. It means so much to me. Hi everyone. In today's conversation with authors, we have someone very special here. This is one of my favorite authors. If you have been watching my channel and also watching my reviews, then you will know how much I love the Dandelion Dynasty series. Like this. This is all of my Ken Liu's books. And yeah, today we have Ken Liu, the author behind the Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, the Hidden Girl and Other Stories, and also the Dandelion Dynasty. So hi Ken Liu. Thank you so much for coming to my channel here. And just to get things started, please, can you introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thank you, Petrik. It's been it's a real honor for me to be here. So I'm Ken Liu. I'm an author, a speculative fiction author. Um, I lived a past life as a programmer and then as a corporate lawyer. I also did some litigation consulting, meaning I serve as an expert witness in patent and trade secret cases before becoming a full-time writer. But that's what I do now. I write full-time. And Patrick has mentioned all of my books. That's pretty much the most important thing I'm hoping that you guys will know, that I write and that those are the books I write, and I love telling stories. So that's me.
Yeah. By the way, for those of you who are watching this, the first part of this conversation will be spoiler-free. But after that, I will be talking about spoilers with Ken Liu, assuming that we have the time, but we will see. But either way, make sure to check the timestamps because I have so many questions. I have so many questions about this series, and yeah, I have to ask Ken Liu as much as I can here. And now let's begin with the first one. You probably get a lot of this question here, but I'm just curious, what was the original idea that made you decide to write the Dandelion Dynasty? And I mean, you mentioned, I think, in one of your acknowledgement that you and your wife Lisa came up with the idea to write the Grace of Kings. And I'm
Yeah.
just curious, what was the original idea for this?
Yeah. So there are actually two ideas, if you will,
Okay.
that started the Dandelion Dynasty. So um, the Grace of the Kings itself had a very specific start, which was this was more than 10 years ago,
Wow.
and um, I had been writing short stories and publishing them for a long time, but I had never written a novel before.
Hmm.
And so I was talking with my wife Lisa at the time, and I was like, it would be interesting to try to write a novel. I mean, I don't know what sort of novel I would want to do, but there might be an interesting idea here. And then Lisa and I started talking, and we started talking about the fact that we both really love these old wuxia TV
Hmm.
shows and novels, especially the ones by Jin Yong.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we sort of really liked the way they blended Eastern and Western traditions. I think that's
Hmm.
something that a lot of people who read wuxia are not really. I don't hear it discussed much or talked about much. I know a lot of uh, literary critics who actually study wuxia do talk about it, but I don't really hear about it in the popular discussion much, which is that wuxia, especially the ones written by Jin Yong, really reflect a very
Hmm.
deep integration of Western and Eastern traditions. Jin Yong himself was a TV writer, and so he learned a lot about his dramatic instincts from Western, the language of film, and especially in
Hmm.
Western
Hmm.
plays, and English novelists. And he also had a huge, deep education in traditional Chinese novels and
Okay.
traditional Chinese storytelling. And Wuxia is a really wonderful way in which he shows how he can sort of blend the stylistic techniques of
Hmm.
very different narrative traditions and then create something very very unique thing. I think it's always weird to me that Westerners who look at wuxia, especially what Jin Yong writes, and call it Chinese.
Oh,
It's
okay.
much more accurate to call it cosmopolitan. Jin Yong is a cosmopolitan writer, and he deliberately blended traditions. So to call it Chinese is sort of not really respecting the fact that he was someone who was a master who blended traditions, not someone who
Hmm.
merely followed in one tradition. that aspect of it was deeply inspiring to me. And so, I spoke with, so Lisa and I were thinking, is there some way to write um, a fantasy novel that recasts the events of um, the rise of the Han Dynasty, which is a
Uh,
historical period that I was deeply in love with,
okay.
and turn it into a modern epic fantasy using the same sort of blend of Eastern Western techniques that Jin Yun
Mm,
used. So
mm,
that's what the genesis of it was. Lisa eventually got too busy, so she didn't really end up pursuing the idea beyond that discussion. But I really wanted to
ah,
um, write the novel. So we actually tried to write it together for a while, but then Lisa got really too busy, so I sort
mm,
of took it over and ended up writing The Grace of Kings. But as I was writing it, I sort of realized that there's a second part of the story here, which is
mm.
um, I realized that I didn't actually want to do just a historical retelling kind of fantasy. I realized that that's not the reason why I found the history of the Han Dynasty so interesting.
Uh,
It turns out that a lot of times when people do historical retellings, they're interested in the history, but a lot of times novelists do this also because they're interested in what that historical reference can tell us about the present. And it's that part
um,
of it that's really interesting to me. A question that has always been very interesting to me is the whole idea of modernity, the invention of modernity, right? So I go around the world talking to a lot of people, and one thing that always struck me is how a lot of people who are outside of the Anglo-American sphere speak about modernity as and the way modernity feels to them as a translated experience.
oh,
So I get this from a lot of people. So the idea is this, right? You may speak, your native tongue or your own language in your family, but when you get educated, when you're trying to learn about science, about economics, whatnot, your education tends to be conducted in English or
mm,
French or
mm,
German or some language that is associated with the colonial history of the
mm,
world. It's not going to be one of the tongues of your birth. And so a lot of people tell me that they experience the translatedness of modernity. That is, they grow up learning a certain set of stories, speaking a certain set of words, and seeing the world through a certain set of images. But
mm.
then once they become educated as a member of the modern mobile symbol manipulating elite, they become acculturated into a translated experience. There's no way for them to talk about concepts of science, of physics, of economics without resorting to English or French or German. They can't do it in the tongue of their birth. So modernity
Mm,
for them is a translated experience. And I definitely understand what they mean by that. As an immigrant to the US myself, I experienced that myself. And I just didn't realize that this is actually kind of a very broad, universal experience, not merely limited to immigrants to the US. So I thought deeper about it. I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And then I realized that modernity itself, even for English speakers and for French speakers and for German speakers, is a translated experience because
ah, right.
modernity began in the Renaissance. And what is the Renaissance but an effort to translate the classical past into modernity? So that
Ah,
is why the words we use for science are often not vernacular words. They're not Anglo-Saxon words. They're
mm,
words derived from Latin, from Greek.
mm.
And this is actually true for everybody. So modernity is a translated experience, not just for those who belong to the colonial, the people who came and did this to the world, but also to everybody. All of us living a translated sort of experience for modernity. It's just we don't always think of it that way. And
Mhm.
then I thought about how the U.S. views itself. I mean, American history is always to me the most interesting part of history, and American identity, the way Americans view ourselves, and we view ourselves, and the way we speak about ourselves. It's very interesting. Our politicians from the days of the founding fathers deliberately evoke models like the Roman model for to describe ourselves. We have
Mm,
a Senate, we have the Capitol, right? We
mhm.
have we have our Federalist papers were actually written by authors who adopted for themselves Roman names. There's this very deep reference, this deep love of Roman models, as though America were simply yet another Rome, as though our history is simply a repeat of Roman history. That to me is deeply
Mm.
interesting. Why do we do that?
Uh,
Why is it that our American modernity is constructed on this idea of referring to our Roman past? We're not Romans. We barely have anything to do with them, and yet imaginatively we view themselves as Romans. So I said, okay, well, that's all fine and good. But, as an American myself, I am free to reinterpret the story. What if
uh,
I took the story of the Han Dynasty and used it to construct modernity the same way contemporary Americans always speak about Rome as a model for America? What if I could
uh,
reuse Han Dynasty China as a model for modern American and retold the rise of a modern multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-identity, multiracial, a truly diverse modern nation? What if I reimagined and retold the fantasy story of that emergence, of that
mhm.
political entity using East Asian history as the
Yeah.
mythological basis? So that's what the Grace of Kings ended up becoming. The Grace of Kings ended up serving as sort of a prequel to the story I actually wanted to do. I had to cram basically all the historical mythological foundation into the Grace of Kings, so I could then tell the rest of the story that I wanted to tell in the Wall of Storms and the Veiled Throne and Speaking
Picking
Bones.
bones.
That's the story of the rise of a modern nation, very similar in a lot of ways to the United States or to really any sort of modern nation that is constructed from a mythological identity, not merely some sort of mono-racial, mono-ethnic idea.
Yeah, yeah.
Any modern nation that's constructed out of this idea of a mythological identity that must encompass multiple traditions and multiple peoples. That's the kind of story I wanted to tell.
And you certainly did that.
Thank you.
Because that's what I found as well. Because the first time I read through the Grace of Kings, it was heavily rooted in the Chu Han contention, right? In the historical
Exactly.
aspect. Yeah. And then I just kind of thought maybe this is just, as you said, it is a prequel. It is a prequel to the
Mm-hmm.
main content of the Dandelion Dynasty. And then everything just changed in the Wall of Storms so much. Yeah, so much. I cannot talk spoilers yet, but yeah, so much insane stuff happened in the Wall of Storms, and it is incredible. It is incredible stuff, really.
Thank you.
And speaking of that, from my perspective here, you are kind of maybe a planner type of writer, but I just want to confirm: are you a pantser or a planner type of writer? Because, like for example,
Oh boy.
as I read through the series, especially when I reach the Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones, there is a certain character here. Okay, I'm just going to mention the name, Gia Matiza. So many. Oh my god, I hate her so much. But so many of her actions, kind of originated from what happened in the Grace of Kings. And I'm just curious, have you planned this from the beginning, even before you started writing The Veiled Throne and Speaking Boons?
So the answer is uh, it depends on
Okay.
your point of view. So I am a planner in certain respects, but in other ways, I don't really plan at all.
Oh,
So
okay.
I will tell you what things I did plan and what things I didn't.
Okay.
So some of the things that I did plan, I knew even as I was writing The Grace of Kings, what the final scene of Speaking Bones would be. I
Oh,
actually knew
wow.
that 10 years before I wrote it. So when I finally wrote it, it was sort of surreal because this is a scene that I had seen in my head for 10 years
Wow.
before I actually wrote it down. So in that respect, I always knew where things were going. I always knew what would happen. Um, I also knew what the fates of all this is not really a spoiler.
Yeah.
There are four siblings who are very important to
Yeah.
the arc of the series, and I always knew what their fates would be. I knew before I wrote the books what that would be.
Mm.
I knew what what, Empress Gia, I knew about her and what she was going to do. And um, I also knew that her skill would end up being, her profession, if you will, would end up becoming super important to it. So I knew these things. So the analogy I use is I'm sort of like one of those people um, who know ahead of time that there are these islands in the sea that I want to get to. And I'm going to sail my ship to those islands. I know where they are and I know what they approximately look like, but I don't really know exactly how I'm going to get there. And I will just start sailing and then figure out along the way how I'm going to get from here to here. So, in some respects, I'm a very deep planner because I have planned these islands ahead of time. But in other respects, I'm not very detail oriented at all because I don't know the course. I go out and then figure out um, as it happens how I want to sail. And sometimes I'll even let the characters guide me. So, for example, this is also not a spoiler.
Mm,
At the end of the third book,
mm.
The Veiled Throne, there's a sequence that comes in that serves the role of a traditional epic battle. So most epic fantasy have this huge epic battle somewhere in there, and that is true of the Dandelion Dynasty series,
Yeah.
except for book three. In book
Cooking.
three, what is typically a big battle is a different thing.
Yeah.
That thing, um, there are four characters who are very important to that thing. And those four characters were not there. They showed up in one of the revision passes. They weren't in the original draft at all. They showed up in one of the revision passes, and they demanded to be part of the story. So I just let them come in, and then they sort of obviously
Ah.
changed the rest of the book. If you read the whole series, it will seem sort of incredible that those four characters weren't actually there in the first draft, but they
Yeah,
weren't.
yeah,
They
yeah.
showed up in the revision pass and they became very integral to it. So that happens. So
Amazing.
not a planner in that respect.
Yeah, yeah.
Even if other things I did plan.
But you certainly have some visions on some scenes already, and you fulfilled that.
Yeah, I had very detailed ideas about certain things. I mean, architecturally, I did draw a picture that ended up being the structure for books three and four, and that picture was very important. So if you read the books, you know that the timeline in these books is very complicated. You have
Yeah.
to shift back and forth. It's almost like one of those space operas where you have to sort of account for time dilation and relativistic effects. So I drew a picture to account for all this stuff to figure out how long it takes for something to get from one place to another and to make sure the events line up.
Ah,
That picture I drew for books three and four at the beginning of it. Then I pretty much relied on it as I drafted it. So that kind of planning I do, but not to the level of outlining chapters and figuring out exactly what's going to happen. I don't do that.
yeah, yeah. And I love that there feels to be so much freedom in your storytelling here. I mean, from reading your books, I read a lot of fantasy books, and yours seems like it's impossible to predict, at least for me anyway, because you include so many stuff from other, let's say, other genres, like technological advancement, you have epic battles, you have everything. Everything is in your books. And in a way, some people would argue that your book isn't technically super rooted in epic fantasy, but you also have mentioned this that you do not believe in genre distinction, right? And it's not just in it's not just in the Dandelion Dynasty. In your collection of short stories, I also felt that, and that's also one of the things that I love so much about your books. So I'm just worried. I'm just curious. Were you ever worried about how this would be perceived by your readers?
Um, I mean, I'm always worried to some extent about how
Okay,
people
that's true.
interpret things. I mean, I don't know if all authors are like this, but I certainly am not one of those authors who write solely for the joy of writing, right? I mean, I
Oh,
did
okay.
I did enjoy um inventing Dandelion Dynasty and coming up with, Dara and all of it. But if you told me that the point here is to just write it and then no one else would ever read it, I'm not sure I would do it. I think like many authors, I write so that I actually can connect with people. I mean, I do feel like writing is actually a communicative act. There
Yeah.
are writers out there who solely write with no regard to whether anyone's going to ever read it. In fact, they would prefer no one ever read it. I'm not one of those people. I just don't. I'm not saying that's not respectable in its own way. If you're the sort of writer who wants to write with no one ever reading it, that's fine. But then, don't ever publish it. That's fine. But I'm one of those authors who actually am interested in publishing. So I do want to connect with people. But that puts you into a bind, right? Because if you're interested in connecting with readers, then you have to sort of make a decision. Do you always want to be understood by the largest number of people, or do you want to be understood by people who get you? Because those are not the same things, right? We all know that there are some stories that can appeal to a large audience, just huge. But you also at the same time lose something when you do that. If your aim is to appeal to the widest possible readership, you also lose something. There are things you just can't do. So you just have to decide for yourself what matters more. The poet James Merrill, who is one of my favorite poets, he was always considered somebody who's a little bit obscure. So James Merrill is one of those people who wrote poetry with expectation that his readers would know all his references. So he would refer to all sorts of obscure Roman, Greek, French, Italian, German stuff, whatever he wanted to. He would make opera references. He went to operas. He actually enjoyed it. Not many people got a chance to go to opera. So, his poems were known for being obscure and difficult. And he was interviewed at one point about this, and people were like, do you ever find it frustrating that you don't have a wider readership? And he says, well, I don't. I mean, he says, look, here's the thing. You can either throw dynamite into the fish pond and just get all the fish, or if you're interested in just the few silver carp, then you should make the bait just for the silver carp. I'm interested in the silver carp, so I'm going to make my poems for the silver carp. And if I don't get all the other fish, so be it. So that kind of is my philosophy. I write my books and they are published to a mass audience. And I know that they're not for everyone. There will be some readers who will be like, you call this epic fantasy, but this is not this is not epic fantasy. And that's fine. I get it. I'm not a big fan of genre labels, but when I'm selling these books, the publisher wants you to put a label on them. And so epic fantasy was the closest thing. I mean, that's actually the reason why I originally invented the term soappunk, because I just wanted to signal to people, I know this is not necessarily, adhering to all the genre conventions. I know this is not necessarily epic fantasy the way a lot of people expect epic fantasy to be. That's fine. And I don't mean something like it has Asian references. There are tons of epic fantasy with Asian references, so that's not the issue. I mean, it's unusual in the way that the Grace of Kings is written. The Grace of Kings itself being a fairly beat by beat reimagining of the Chuhan contention is strange. It's deliberately written in a way that's pre-modern. That's the best way I can explain it. It's not a modern novel. It uses a very old style. It's very omniscient. It's very epic in the sense of epic poetry, not epic fantasy. It's very high. It tries to do characterization by relying entirely on externalities. With modernism, we have the sense that the depth of a character is revealed by interiority. But that's not the way it was done in older styles of literature, and the Grace of Kings leans into that. It's meant to be a very old kind of style. It's more the way Achilles and the Aeneid or something like that would be written. The way it very consciously relies on external characterization events, the way it really very explicitly addresses the reader and expects the reader to be able to figure out based on these little pieces what the overall story is. It's very much, overtly a story about a people, not about individuals. And I think, readers who are not expecting that coming into it would be very discomforted. I think that's the term for it. Some
Hmm.
readers will eventually see what I'm trying to do and get it, and some will not, and that's totally fine. So did I worry about it not being received correctly or whatever? Um, Not really, in the sense that I don't think there's a correct way to read a book. There's a way that is the way I'm meant to tell the story, and readers who
Yeah.
connect with that would obviously enjoy it. But if readers don't connect with that, I don't think they're wrong. It's just
Yeah.
not for them.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that we're living in an age where there are a bazillion other books. So if you DNF, I'm really happy because now you're not wasting your time and you're making me feel happy that you can go find something else that you enjoy. So I strongly encourage you to not bother pushing on the book if you don't feel
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
working for you. I think that's actually really good. I wrote the book to appeal to readers who get what this is
Yeah.
trying to do. And if you get it, I'm super happy. So that's why, this conversation is particularly fun for me,
Yeah.
to connect with readers who resonated with it and said, this is actually kind of cool. Yes, it is kind of cool. That's why I wrote it.
It is super cool. But I would say though, in a way, you encapsulate what is so good about the fantasy genre. I mean, it is limitless imagination. There shouldn't be like,
Absolutely.
I mean, for example, in Brandon Sanderson's books, some of his books, uh, he started including a lot of scientific stuff into it. And some people are really bothered by this because they consider that this has started to become a science fiction. But from my perspective, why couldn't this be included in the fantasy genre when the entire fantasy genre should be filled with limitless imagination? That's
I agree. I mean, there are so many epic fantasy that are historical retellings, and so many epic fantasy that are just actually departures from history, but trying to do something really new. There
yeah,
are tons of fantasies that incorporate ideas about democratic governance, tons of fantasy that deal with the ideas about, what does it mean to actually engage very deeply with uncertainty, with loss of faith in authority. Just it's like I feel like in some ways, epic fantasy is an even more inclusive genre than so-called realist fiction because
mm-hmm.
in some ways, realist fiction is so tied to the dictates of what is respectable and what we can talk about realistically, that it's very hard to talk about certain things. So, for example, right, the topic that I want to talk about, which is modern identity, the
Mm.
sense of modernity, the sense of a modern person. How do we, as many of us anyway, as citizens of multi-ethnic, multinational states, how do we construct our identity vis-a-vis the larger polity that engages us, and how do we construct our identity vis-a-vis the multiplicity of stories all around us? If you try to write a realist novel that explicitly sets out to say this is a novel about the fate of the American people will laugh at you. It's just such a grandiose, ludicrous claim, and it's not something that people think realistic fiction should be about. Realist fiction must be about the interior experience of the individual. It has
Yeah.
to be tiny, has to be small, has to be specific. That's where modernism has driven itself. But if you write in the form of an epic fantasy, you can talk about things like the fate of nations, the idea
Yeah.
of national identity, all these things. That's okay because people are okay with you engaging with it. That's why, epic fantasy to me is a much more natural form to address the sort of things I wanted to talk about. Even if I ended up not writing particularly a very genre exemplary
Hmm.
instance of it, that's okay. I at least found approximately the right place to do it, even if I ended up writing a particular version of it.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Yeah. And I'm just curious about this because you have so many characters. You have so many characters in the Dandelion Dynasty, and they are some of my favorites all of all time, like Kunigaru, Matazindu, and then
Hmm.
Terra, Gin Mazzotti. Gin Mazzotti is my personal favorite.
It is
Okay.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And but one of my favorite things about this is that you write some of the best women that I've read in the entire epic fantasy
Thank
genre.
you.
They are badass, they kick ass, whether they are good at physical prowess or not. They are just so good and memorable from my perspective, anyway. And Uh, how do you go about writing all of them? They all have their own distinct personality.
Well, I mean, I don't think I do anything special. I mean, I think I do the same thing that all writers do, which is you model characters on real people. Okay, you learn about people by thinking deeply about the people you know and to
Hmm.
empathize with them, to see inside them, and then you understand them as individuals, and then you try to model your characters on aspects of people you know, or on yourself. That's why you can have something like, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. It's not just it's not an empty statement. Emma Bovary really is the author in some sense, and I think that's true for all characters. So that's what I do. I mean, I think about all the women that in the case of women characters in particular, I think about the women I know. I think about my grandmother,
Hmm.
who actually taught me and told me the stories of the Han Dynasty, and who sort of gave me my first stories. And I
Hmm.
think about what she's like when she's angry. I think about what she's like when she's trying to help me. I think about how she expresses her love. I think about how she tries to accomplish her goals. I think about how she works with her students. I think about how
Hmm.
she um, tries to teach people what she knows. I think about that, and then I put aspects of that into Gia, into Zomi, into Thera, into all the people I
Yeah.
know, and then I do the same thing with my college friends, my high school friends, my elementary school friends, my wife, my daughters. I think about all the wonderful judge I clerk for, who is the best
Hmm.
boss ever, who taught me all there is to know about being a lawyer. It's great when you know a lot of people, you have more to draw on for your own characters. And so I work to think and to really empathize and to understand the people I know. That I
Hmm.
use that understanding in constructing the characters. And to the extent that that comes across as good, it's a validation for the people I know, that they have become part of my understanding of humanity, and that is why I was able to write the characters I was able to write,
Hmm. Yeah.
and that's very cool.
Yeah. And that's why I also think that they really felt like real person to me. All of them, every single one of them, they felt like real person to me. So with that in mind, do you have any favorite characters to write?
Wow.
Yeah.
It's hard to pick just one. I'll say a few. I mean, I definitely found it very interesting to write from Gia's perspective. I think Gia is probably one of my favorite characters in terms of how complicated and interesting her mind is, and I have to work really hard to think about how she feels and to really empathize and experience
Hmm. Hmm.
what she experiences. Um, I also really love writing Thera and Farah. Farah, in
Hmm.
some ways, the youngest imperial child,
Yeah.
is probably closest to me in personality in terms of her artistic
Hmm.
interest and her general she had these instances where her artistic style was different, and so she
Yeah.
had some hard time getting finding the audience that she needed. So I identify with that very much. So it's really a lot of fun to write her. Who else? I love writing Luan Zia. His
Oh
love
yeah, yeah, Valencia.
of engineering, of building things, of actually creating things and constructing things. It really, taps into my background as a technologist, as someone in the tech industry.
Hmm.
I really love doing that. That was a lot of fun. Um, I think it might be easier to talk about characters who I hated writing as opposed to characters I loved writing. I mean, there are villains. I don't
Yeah.
think it will surprise anyone that the villains are hard to write. A
They are
lot of
so
times,
they are so evil though.
right? So what I say is, this is something that I try to follow, which is I always write all of my characters with a great deal of empathy,
Okay.
which I think people sometimes don't understand what that means. Um, so in the case of villains, I have to actually be very empathetic to them in the sense of I need to understand what is the story they're telling themselves, and
Hmm.
what is the story that shapes their worldview such that they can do these horrible things and still believe that they are the heroes of their own grand stories.
Oh,
Because it is simply a matter of fact that heroes in our world do terrible things. You
mm,
know, a lot of people we call heroes are mass killers. That's just
yeah.
what they are. They make decisions that kill thousands, sometimes millions of people. You know, the cynical might say that if you kill one person, you're a murderer, but if you kill a million people, you're a great hero.
Mm,
They're not entirely wrong. I mean, it is very cynical, but they're not entirely wrong. So I keep that in mind. So when I try to write these villains, I try to be empathetic in the sense of I need to understand their story and why they think they're the heroes. That's not the same thing as being sympathetic. I think this is
mm,
something that I really want to emphasize and people don't always get. You can be empathetic to a villain without losing your own conscience and your own. You
mm.
don't have to descend into moral relativism just because you're empathetic to everyone. You
Yeah.
can be empathetic to everyone without being sympathetic to everyone.
Mm,
So it was very hard for me to empathize with certain characters without, you know, spoiling things. But
yeah.
it's very hard for me to empathize with certain characters because their point of view is just so alien to me.
Yeah.
I've never been somebody who is 100% convinced that I have the truth. I don't understand people like that. I mean, you know, the people who lead the Inquisition, who, you know, slaughter infidels, whatever that means, who lead these grand crusades. I don't understand people like that. I've never been 100% convicted of the that I have the right answer. How can you?
Yeah.
But some people are like that, and the villains are like that.
Yeah.
And I have a very hard time trying to get into that mindset and to empathize. So, you know, I do a lot of work by reading their autobiographies, by reading their own statements, by trying as much as I can to understand their own story from their own perspective, knowing all the while that a lot of times it's a performance and you have to sort of
Mm,
accept that as a performance and you have to sort of see beyond the performance. But it is possible to read the words of the villains and to see by which I mean real world villains,
yeah.
not fictional ones, but like actually evil people. It's possible to read their words and to see beyond the performance and to understand that actually there is a story underneath the mask. There is a story that allows them to do what they do, that allows them to
Mm,
believe that they are
yeah.
in fact correct. And once you understand that story, you can then, you know, create fictional versions of it that feel true to human nature, without being sympathetic to them. You know, it's possible to empathize with people who do evil without
Mm,
actually excusing them and thinking that somehow they are right. To
yeah.
know
Yeah.
their story is not to forgive them.
Yeah. That's that's really true. I think in a way that's also kind of what in a fictional villain, that's kind of what makes them so interesting sometimes. It's
Mhm.
not like we agree with their actions, but we can actually see why they do those
Correct.
vile
Correct.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't know if necessarily that's true in real life. There are
Yeah, yeah.
times that people who are in real life who do terrible things who have no story. You know, if you look for a story, it's just empty. There's nothing there. You know, I won't name any names, but you
Yeah.
can think of figures who you're like, what is their story? What is the story behind their story? And you try to look for it, and there's nothing there. It's empty. They're just agents of chaos,
Yeah, yeah.
and that's perfectly okay too. But those characters are not hard to write, in my view, because there's
Mm,
nothing to empathize with. You know, pure agents of chaos are easy to write. Life is, you know, pretty much one random thing after another. So
yeah.
agents of chaos are easy to write, but villains who actually have a story, who actually think they're the heroes of their own journeys, those are hard to write because you have to actually empathize with them to write them believably.
Yeah. Yeah. I get it. And you actually killed off plenty of your characters. Seriously, man, that is just it hurts me. But I'm also happy for it because because of you doing this, after making me care so much about all many of your characters, you ramp up the intensity of the narrative. The narrative intensified so much, and also it makes the story more emotional. But do you for you as a writer here, it did it hurt you when you kill these characters?
Some of them for sure. I mean, again, I won't,
Yeah,
spoil things, but
yeah,
certainly one of the siblings who, went on for multiple volumes, but
yeah,
in the end, the story couldn't really work with them.
yeah,
Not, uh, you know, some of these deaths are terrible. They're terrible for me, and terrible
mm,
to write. It was very hard to write some of these deaths because I really want them to make it all the way to the end. Um, but that's not their story. Their story ends there. And one of the themes of the novels is that um, sometimes the way we judge somebody is terribly unfair because
mm,
they died a little bit too early or a little bit too late, and then we'll
mm,
never know how they're going to turn out. And that means that some characters have to die before you know
mm.
readers can really see what their potential could
Yeah,
have been. And then that hurts more than anything else. But that's also true to life. And so I had to sort of honor that too. But yeah, some of these that are incredibly difficult for me, even in revisions. I mean, I wrote some of these things, and I revised them multiple times over the long period of time that I wrote the books. And I would come to that scene every time, month apart. And every time I get to it, I would still have an emotional hard time getting through it. So that's
yeah,
how I knew that it's actually worked. That
yeah, yeah,
even I am reluctant to just go through it.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that means I put myself into it, and that's the best I could do.
Yeah. And one of the most interesting about this series is that because I came from reading the paper Menagerie and other stories, right?
Mhm.
I read your short story collection first. I also read The Hidden Girl first. So for these two collection of stories, battle scenes are well rare. Probably didn't exist. Probably didn't
I don't think
exist.
they ever exist. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think
I
I've
don't think
written one.
I don't think there's any battle scenes. But in this series, especially from the Wolf Storms and also Speaking Bones, the battle scenes are insane. It is massive in scope. It is epic. It is epic. And did you struggle with writing this, or did you learn how to do it? Because yeah, as I said, I didn't see those in the collection of short stories.
I mean, obviously, I had to learn how to do them.
Yeah.
Um, but it turned out to be a lot more. Um, I don't want to say easy because that
Yeah.
gives the wrong impression. The process of learning how to write battle scenes and to write them turned out to be far more fun and interesting than I had anticipated. I
Ah.
was a little worried about them because I'm not. Um, Believe it or not, I'm actually very much the part of history that interests me the least are the battles.
Okay.
I
Okay.
find battles to be deeply uninteresting, and mainly because I'm a pacifist. So I'm very much opposed to all histories that glorify military leaders. I'm just not a
Mm,
huge fan of military history.
mm,
Um, but it turns out that for purposes of writing these books, I had to learn a lot of military history and
yeah.
learn very deep military history. And that ended up giving me a whole new respect for warfare, in a way that I did not appreciate before. I mean, learning about what the individual soldier must go through to do this and to survive this is gave me a whole new level of respect for the entire
Mm,
military that I don't think I quite understood beforehand. And learning about the complexities of military strategy also just ended up being hugely interesting. And then trying to apply that knowledge again, empathetically writing about the experience of soldiers,
mm,
of generals, of people who hold the responsibility of actually sending people to die and to kill other people. I mean, it's really really hard, reading the memoirs and the biographies and autobiographies and the actual words of fighting men and women throughout history and what they had to go through. Um, you know, After you learn all of that, you realize that it's battles are nothing like the way history books teach you. It's not
Yeah.
about moving little pieces on the chessboard. It's just not. And it's nothing like the glorious propaganda movies show you. It's not. People don't go out there and think it's somehow wonderful to go out there and it's
Mm.
sweet and fitting to kill and to die for your country. It's nothing like that. It's just wow, so
Yeah.
so incredibly moving. And so I had to learn, how to put some of that into the fictional
Mm.
portrayal, how to get some of that across, and how to reflect that aspect of the human experience. Um, I ended up having to do a lot of modeling, a lot of very detailed plotting out of things and thinking through how people will get tired throughout the day, how people will get tired after weeks of this, what the support from the civilian population might be like, what kind of off the battlefield things were happening, just sort of understanding all of this in a really comprehensive way, not as a cartoonish thing, which
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, um,
Mm.
we're all sort of used to the way games like Civilization portray battles. Everything really does seem like a game, but it's not. I
Mm.
mean, that's one of the things I had to sort of learn when I'm doing this, that it's not a game. This is incredibly brutal and horrible, and I really
Yeah.
had to learn that to absorb it. I mean, I sort of knew that at one level, but until you do, I mean, until you go through it yourself, you never understand it. And I will never really understand it. But
Yeah.
trying to just understand the next best thing, which is to read the first-hand accounts and really understand that
Mm.
description, that at least helped me a lot in terms of writing these things in a semi, uh, uh, I would say, semi um, truthful way, as true
Mm.
as I could make it. And so learning to write the battle scenes was not, I wouldn't say it was difficult. It was difficult emotionally, but in terms of the technical aspects of learning how to write a battle scene and do it properly to honor the people who do the fighting, that part was not difficult.
Yeah, yeah. I love everything about all the build up, all the battles itself. I love all of them. I think the Battle of Zatingulf in particular is wow, it is in my list of the most well-written battle scenes, in my opinion. It's just so good. Well done on that.
Thank you.
And it's not only that, all the battles in Speaking Bones as well. But I think to talk about them, I will have to talk spoilers.
Right, right. So
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I know what you mean.
So, speaking of spoilers, I'm just going to get to the last question before we move on to the spoiler territory here. So, then that I think it's quite safe to assume that the Dandelion Dynasty is the most complex, ambitious stories that you have ever written so far. I mean,
For sure.
this is 4 volumes, 4 massive volumes. And I'm curious, now that you write long fiction novels and also short fiction, will you be going back to writing long fiction novels soon, or maybe you're taking a break right now?
You know, I'm still recovering from that. I gotta tell you, writing the Dandelion Dynasty took a lot out of me. I mean, I told you it took 10 years to do. Um,
Yeah.
the part that I haven't mentioned yet is that, these two books, the Veil of Throne, Speaking Bones, this came out as two separate books, but they were written as a single book.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wrote this as a single book. So, to give you a sense of that, this is like a 2,000 page long book. I spent 5 years on it, and every revision pass took like multiple months, sometimes more than a year. It would take me
Wow.
more than a year to go from the beginning to the end to do
Yeah,
my
yeah.
revisions. So one of the passes took 14 months. Um,
Wow.
that that
Amazing.
took a lot out of me. I mean, a lot.
Yeah.
Just the amount of notes I had to keep, the amount of thinking I had to do, the amount of rewriting of every single sentence, every single word, every single paragraph, and to sort of go and make sure that things hinted at in book one would pay off in book four. I mean,
Yeah.
none of that came for free. That
Yeah.
was stuff that I had to actually do and manage. It took a lot out of me. I mean, I gotta say, there were times where I felt like I knew Dara better than I knew the real world.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
um, and it is a monumental task. And I definitely loved it. But I also have to tell you that during the drafting of it, a lot of times I felt completely lost. It was
Yeah.
emotionally extremely draining because, you know, I felt like I was one of those workers working on the Sphinx, and all I could see was this little square of rock in front of me, and I'm chiseling at it, chiseling at
Yeah,
it. I
yeah,
have no idea whether the thing is lopsided. Did I get the tail right? I mean, I can't even get far enough to see the entire statue. And
yeah,
worst of all, it's not like thousands of people are working on it. There's just me.
yeah,
I'm a
yeah.
single worker trying to carve the Sphinx. I really felt like the story was too much for me. And when you are working on the same thing for 5 years with no payoff, it's psychologically very draining. I was emotionally very drained from it. Um,
Mm.
so all that is to say, I finally finished it, and I can't be happier to actually show it at and put it out there and share with readers, and to actually hear back from readers like you who also came into Dara with me. I mean, Dara exists only in my brain, and now everybody's coming in and they're going through Dara with me. I mean, that's an incredible feeling. So
Hmm.
happy. I feel like laughing and crying at the same time sometimes. It's so amazing. But I also at the same time, uh, it took so much out of me that I don't think I can do it anytime
Yeah,
soon. Maybe not
understandable.
ever. Certainly nothing of that size. I mean, my friend Kate Elliott, who is one of the most amazing epic fantasy writers ever,
Okay, Elliot, yeah.
she, yeah, she does this on all the time. I mean, she must have dozens of these series, each as massive. I don't know how she does it because I have only one, and that took so much out of me that I feel like, I have lost a part of my brain permanently. The fact that she does it over and over again, it's amazing to me. I'm not like that. I can't do what Kate does. So I don't think I
Um,
have another Dandelion Dynasty in me. I think this is it. But I would love to write another novel in the future and multiple novels. But I think I'm going to stay away from a massive series
yeah.
like this for a while, because this was like constructing a whole world and actually living in it, and making every piece of it fit. It's a little much. I think my brain is not capable of doing this multiple times in a row, so I'm going to take a little break from it.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. And from my perspective, at least this is from my opinion, this is one of the best in epic fantasy. Seriously, one
Thank
of
you.
the best. So well done on creating this magnum opus.
Thank you.
So I think that's the end of the spoiler-free discussion. So if you haven't read the Dandelion Dynasty yet, well, what are you waiting for? Make sure to do that. I have talked about it on my channel so many times. It's pretty much what I talk about. It's my personality for the entirety of this year. So yeah, if you haven't read that first, and then after that you can go back to this video and watch the spoiler discussion. So once again, just a reminder: if you haven't read the Dandelion Dynasty, move away now. I'm going to be talking about spoilers. Okay. Okay. Now
All
let's.
right, suitably warned.
Yeah, suitably warned, right? I still have so many questions, but we will be sitting all day if I just end up asking all of them.
I
So
believe it. I believe it.
yeah, so let's move on to the spoiler questions. So I'm going to start from the beginning here. It's about Kunigaru and Mata Zindu. So both of them, as we talk about, they are from very very reminiscent of the Chuhan contention, Liu Bang and Shang Yu, right? And but I know that my knowledge on this is very rusty now, but from what I remember, I cannot remember caring about them in the historical text. Sorry, I was forced to learn, okay? I was forced to learn about this part of history. But you made them, even though technically The Grace of Kings isn't the most character-focused kind of book, but you managed to make them so well. They're so easy for me to get invested in. So do you struggle with writing these characters? I mean, they are heavily rooted in the history, but you also at the same time have to make sure their personality is well written, well developed.
Well, history records their deeds, but it doesn't really, record their motivations, their
Yeah, that's the
interiority,
thing.
if you
That's
will,
the
right?
thing. Yeah.
So what I was trying to do was to map them to archetypes. So Kunigaru ended up being mapped to the archetype of somebody like Odysseus.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Matazindu got mapped to the archetype of Achilles. And so this was
Mm.
very explicit. So if you read the Grace of Kings, you'll see that there are references to the wrath of Matazindu. And that's
Yeah,
obviously a reference to the wrath of Achilles.
Achilles.
Um,
Yeah.
and and there's a lot of discussion about how Cooney is very wily, very much of a Ulysses, Odysseus kind of description. And that was explicit. It was intentional to sort of get readers to see that these are, in some ways, archetypes. But archetypes are not interesting by themselves. The interesting
Mm.
part is to what extent that they are real people inhabiting archetypes. So that's where I got into it. History records this exchange between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu, where Xiang Yu threatens to kill Liu Bang's father, and Liu Bang says, "Fine, make sure when you cook him, send me some of the meat." Right? So history records this. This is just a bare history, and you're sort of like, what was Liu Bang really doing when he said that? Did
Yeah,
he
yeah.
really say that because he didn't care, or did he say that because he had some plot in his mind? That's where the interesting thing is, right? You think about what would make somebody say that.
Yeah.
What would make somebody say that either as a trick or as an actual belief or as part of his larger, three-dimensional chess game? Like what is this? That's where the fun is. So I had sort of get into uh writing that part and figure out what would cause Matazindu to go through this horrible process of just, willy-nilly assigning people to random states without any care about their ability. What would cause somebody to go in there and think that nobility of character just means you have to restore the old aristocratic system? Why would somebody believe that this is the way to go forward? And similarly, for somebody like Kunigaru, what would make him think that he is better suited to rule? Why does he think that he gets to speak for the people?
Yeah,
And since I'm using history as a takeoff point to talk about modernity, how do I turn Matazindu and Kunigaru from historical analogs into modern people? Like, if I were to take a society with a philosophical um, and the technology background of Dara at that time, how would somebody like Matazindu reflect a yearning and the nostalgia for an aristocratic past? And
yeah.
how would Kunigaru represent a step into the modern era, into modernity? How would Kunigaru represent what we would think of as the Renaissance, or the
Mm.
emergence of democratic governance, of a sense of a nation based on a story rather than based on blood? What does that mean, even?
Yeah.
So I think about this and I try to write the characters so that they are based on their historical analogs, but they become my characters, serving the purpose of the story I wanted to tell in the
Yeah.
future volume. This is Grace of Kings serves as mythical history for
Yeah.
the actual story that's going to be told.
Yeah. And it makes me sad seeing them because they just care so much about each other, but their clash of ideals just fractured them. And yeah, it was so good.
Well, see, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting to me. I'm very interested in story archetypes and why it
Mm.
is that even though human nature is invariant across
Yeah.
cultures and across times, and human nature means that we have all stories in all societies, but certain story patterns get named and
Mm.
rep become sort of key stories in certain cultures and not other cultures, and even though all cultures experience them. So, for example, the in East Asia, there's a story pattern of two people usually who can be the best of friends when they're striving towards a common goal, but
Mm.
once they succeed, they fall against each other. They can't share
Yeah.
the glory.
Mm.
That's a repeated pattern in East Asian stories. Now, when I point that out, people are like, does that mean we don't have those kind of stories in the West? No, of course we do. In fact,
Yeah.
they happen all the time. You look at every startup.
Yeah.
You have the two founders of Apple, but once Apple became a great company, it's not like both of them stuck around, right?
Yeah.
You have
Facebook.
lots of
Facebook. Yeah.
right. You have
Yeah.
lots of stories of of individuals who suffer, who bands that, make it big because everybody's striving together. And once they become big, they can't stand each other. They fight on
Yeah.
each other, right? All the time. And yet, for some bizarre reason, we don't view that as a pattern, as an archetype in the West. We don't have stories that recur over and over again, fictional versions of this that center that experience. Similarly, the teacher-student experience is very core to East Asian storytelling.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
student-teacher relationship is almost as important as the parent-child relationship. And it's not like in the West we don't have students or teachers. It's not like in the West we don't respect teachers or have students who remember their teachers. But for whatever reason, we don't seem to have a cultural pattern of telling stories that center the teacher-student relationship. It's just not a thing that we view as core in the same way the
Mm.
parent-child relationship is, whereas in East Asia it is. So anyway, so one of the reasons I also wanted to write The Grace of Kings and to reflect the modernity is, right, when you tell the story of a modernity or of America using a Roman pattern, you
Mm.
miss certain things. You end up using the same kind of patterns. You're always going to talk about the great orator Cicero, right? We're all going to emulate Cicero. We're all going to talk about the Romans and their dictators and how dangerous it is to have the dictators around, right? So we end up becoming culturally gravitating towards only certain kinds of political stories as
Mm.
relevant to America. But what if you take it from an East Asian pattern, which is all about the bureaucracy, about checks and balances between the bureaucracy and the decision maker? It turns out those stories are incredibly important for America too. The
Mm.
modern American state is almost entirely about conflict between a professional administrative bureaucracy versus those who would want to come in from the outside to reform it. And so to me, it's incredibly interesting to see how we miss these patterns because if you keep on telling the story of America through a Roman lens, you miss other things that are just as important for modern countries, modern nations, for America. So one of the hopes I wanted to uh, in my writing of the Dandelion Dynasty is to get people to think broader about political analogies, to think broader when they want to tell the story of their own country. You
Yeah.
can learn a lot by referring to histories outside of your usual patterns.
Oh yeah,
It's
totally.
no more weird to speak about modern America using classical East Asian history than it is to talk about America in terms of classical Roman history. People think one
Mm.
is somehow strange and the other is natural. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. They're equally natural and equally strange. And that's why, I think my experiment is actually very interesting that way to focus on how it's based on, classical East Asian history or China is sort of to miss the point. This is about modernity. The history is a way to reflect on the modernity
Hmm.
that we're living in, and to get us to see modernity through a different lens, and to sort of think about things we missed when we don't do that.
Yeah. So good. Amazing. Amazing. Amazing explanation to everything, right? Really.
Thank you.
And one of the things that you used to, oh, sorry, one of the things that you use to progress your narrative, well, one of the plot device that you use, well, you killed off pretty much all the main characters of the Grace of Kings in the Wall of Storms. Pretty much all of them. Munigaru, well, Mata Zindu is dead already in the Grace of Kings, and then Gin Mazoti, yeah, that one really hurts. That one really hurts me. But uh, all of many things that happen in the Wall of Storms happen because of Jia Matiza scheming and manipulation. So yeah, I just have to ask this. Uh, do you struggle with the characters? I mean, this character is just so complex. It is just so complex, and yeah, I just have to know your thoughts about writing Matiza.
Yeah, Gia is incredibly complicated and interesting. And I think, if you at the end of the series
Yeah,
are left asking yourself, was Gia a hero or was she a villain?
villain.
Then I think I have achieved my goal,
Yeah,
because she is meant to be somebody who you're not sure. At the end of it, you're still like, is she a great hero or is she a villain? Or are
Mm,
those labels actually meaningless in the case of somebody like her? Because it depends entirely on your point of view, because you can make arguments endlessly. She saved many lives. She
yeah,
hurt many
yeah,
people. She saved the soul of Dara, as she put it, and she also might have irrevocably damaged it
yeah,
in her manipulations. It all depends on your point of view. I mean, if you are against her, you can make an argument that she didn't have to do any of the things she did,
yeah,
that things could have turned out better without her manipulation. But, that's your point of view, because she did not have the luxury of hindsight. She had to do the
yeah,
best she could, given, and history does not allow you to run repeat experiments. You got only one chance. You could also make a very plausible argument that she was, in fact, exactly the hero that she saw herself to be. She did
mm,
the best she could in a horrible situation. She saved the most people. She ended up building the foundation for a modern constitution and monarchy. Without her, I mean, one of the things that you can argue about her is her ideals are all very modern, even if
mm,
her methods are deeply
yeah,
not modern, right? Her ideals, her insistence on fighting against the military industrial complex is incredibly modern. In fact, I don't think many modern leaders can even be as frank and as wise as she is in foreseeing the dangers of
hmm,
letting the military run your
yeah,
policy.
yeah,
She saw that and she was consistently trying to fight against it. And you could argue that her grand plan to set herself up as the tyrant to be put down, therefore inoculating Dara against tyranny for the future, is a stroke of brilliance that very few political leaders ever could match. She was
hmm,
somebody who wanted to preserve a constitutional monarchy and a democracy to be developed in the future by putting herself in the position of the villain to inoculate the republic against it. That is, to me, incredible. But at the same time, you could argue that this is all nonsense. Like, you can never inculcate true virtue through performance like this. She viewed everything
hmm,
as theater, as performance. If that is truly her approach to it, she will never achieve real virtue, because you're always going to treat everything as a mere performance, and you're always going to prize the correct performance over the correct actual deep motivations.
yeah,
So you can argue back and forth forever, and I do. I have argued, made very plausible arguments for why Zia is, in fact, the great hero of the epic, and also why she is also the great villain of the epic. You can definitely make these arguments.
yeah, yeah, totally. But for what it's worth, I think you wrote her so well. As I said already, she's one of the most memorable character. Whether you like her, whether you agree with her or not, whether you hate her, I think she is, yes, just one of the most memorable character, really.
Thank you. And then I think in that way she sort of matches historical analogs. You can
Mm,
talk about somebody um who would be a good example? I don't know. Alexander the Great, right?
mm.
Is Alexander the Great actually great, or is he just a terrible person who killed a lot of people? You
Yeah.
can make the argument either way. And to this day, we still argue over what his legacy actually is.
Yeah, yeah. Still talking about Gia Matizaya. So Gia, as I said in our discussion for the non-spoiler discussion, many of her actions stemmed from what happened in the Grace of Kings. Well, it is basically when she was held hostage by Mata Zindu. And now you can talk freely about how you planned this from the beginning or not for her character development from this
Yeah.
event.
So one of the themes of the Dandelion Dynasty is this whole idea of what a constitution is, right?
Mm,
So I was trained as a lawyer. So lawyers like to speak about constitutions in the form of a document. So
mm.
lawyers obsess over the document, the constitution of a nation. I have a much broader understanding of that. I actually don't think the document matters that much. Um, Here's what I mean. There are lots of nations that
Mm,
have beautiful constitutions drafted by the smartest lawyers in the world, and they're so beautiful, so wonderful, so meticulous, with wonderful institutions and checks and balances. And you know what? The countries that have these constitutions don't work. They don't follow it. They descend into civil disorder. They go into civil war sometimes. The Constitution is nothing more than a piece of paper. It doesn't do anything. There are other countries that have no beautiful written constitution. In fact, there's no written constitution at all. United Kingdom does not have one, and it functions perfectly fine as a democracy. The US has one of the worst constitutions in the world. It's old. It's terrible. We argue about it all the time. And I would argue the US functions for the most part just fine, despite it. So I don't think the paper document matters that much. I think the real constitution is the set of stories that a people tell themselves, that they renew from generation to generation, that they use to explain who they are and what makes them unique and why they are fill in the blank, Americans, French, Indonesian, Singaporean, whatever. Okay. It's the story, the set of stories that become the real constitution. When the stories work, when everyone feels like they are a part of the story, that they have a voice in the story, that this is their story and their children's story, then the country will function. The country will work. Whatever is wrong with the paper document, when the stories work, the people will figure out a way to work around it and make it work. But if the stories don't work, you can have the best document in the world. It doesn't matter. And lawyers know that, whatever the laws are, it's always the stuff outside the law that actually determine whether the laws will function. Because even the best contracts, if you have determined people going at it, they'll find loopholes. So that's not the point. You can't make these things tight. The only way for a contract to actually work is if you have a system in place and a set of assumptions and a set of stories and a larger set of social rules around it to make following the rules work. So anyway, the point is, when I was thinking about constitutions, I'm thinking in terms of stories. So what is this Constitution of the United States? It's a set of stories that we inherit. And a lot of these stories are based on the experience of the founding fathers during the revolution. Why do we have a specific amendment about the quartering of soldiers? Why is the power to tax such an important part of the US Constitution? Why do we care so much about interstate commerce? Why do we interpret the phrase privileges and immunities so weirdly? It's all based on history. This is all, to understand the Constitution, you have to actually understand the constitutive acts that make up the stories that become the Constitution. So, in the case of Dara, I made it very clear that the future constitution of Dara depends on the constitutive acts of its founders. Gia is one of the most important founding mothers of Dara. And her constitutive acts, right? Remember in Speaking Bones, people actually explicitly say this, character actually say, we are the founding generation. Our acts are constitutive acts, weighty as precedent. That's why they say that, because they know that what they do will become the model for future generations. I mean, we see this all the time in America. George Washington had 2 terms, and that's why 2 terms for presidents became a thing. That was not originally in the Constitution, but it became part of the Constitution because that's something that people do. It was a constitutive act. And the Supreme Court, the earliest Supreme Court, said we have the power to interpret and say what the law is. That's nowhere in the Constitution, but now it is accepted as part of the Constitution because these are constitutive acts. They do it. It became part of the story, it became a story that we all believe in. There it is. That's all that matters. So in the case of Gia, that's what this is about. Gia says, everything I do is a constitutive act. I have to make sure I am giving Dara the best constitution possible. So that is why she went on that whole journey about setting herself up as the tyrant to be defeated, so that Dara would have a story to rely on in the future about how anybody who behaved like that is to be put down. The Republic of Dara. I mean, it's not a republic yet, but it will be. The constitutional monarchy of Dara will put down any sovereign who tries to be like Gia. That is what Gia wanted, That is what she accomplished. She wanted that to be part of the story. Now, the part that she didn't expect is Kogo would come in and
Yeah.
reveal her plot and say,
Yeah.
no, the better constitutive act is to reveal everything you did so that we can use the truth. The truth is always a better
Yeah.
constitution.
Yeah.
It's a better story. Now that we know what you did, we are even more inoculated against tyranny. That's my favorite part. That Jia tried to be the master plotter, but the people ended up being wiser than she could ever be. That
Hmm.
is the story that I wanted. That's the constitutive act. She tried to protect the people of Dara, but in the end, she still had to submit to their judgment. It
Yeah.
is the people of Dara that ultimately were the sovereign. And that is the most important message. I mean, in some ways, I was very, that was so important to me because so many people think epic fantasy is about nostalgia for the divine right of kings. It's about the ancient past. No, I'm trying to write this epic fantasy about how a constitution of monarchy can come into being and why the people are the true sovereign. There's a reason why every sovereign of Dara keeps on saying, I serve the people of Dara as
Uh,
your
uh,
emperor.
yeah.
It's very important that every single sovereign says that because this is a recognition from Kunigaru and from
Yeah.
all his descendants that they are not the owners of Dara, as the divine right of kings might have supposed. They are the
Um,
servants of the people. They are the manifestation of the people. So, as constitutional monarchs, ultimately they would have to give up their power to the people. Now, if you remember at the very end of Speaking Bones
yeah.
in the epilogue, there's this really interesting scene where one of the descendants of Kutin Rovo, one of the descendants who now is a high official in Dara's court,
Yeah.
is trying to solve these problems, legacy of the colonial and the genocidal conquest of the Liku. And she says something to the effect of, the fact that the governor Pikyu of Ukiyutasa is still this hereditary position with power is really weird because elsewhere in Dara, every hereditary noble has been stripped of real power. They're only symbols now. The real power belongs to the officials and who are ultimately accountable to the people. So,
Mm-hmm.
Dara is moving towards a constitutional monarchy. But the one thing that statement is supposed to highlight for the reader that there's actually one more hereditary family with power, and that is the imperial family, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
idea here is that if people start to question why the PICU governor is an inherited position, maybe people will start to question why does the imperial family, why does the emperor and the empress have power by heredity? That makes no sense. So this
Mm-hmm.
is planting the seeds for a republic of Dara in the future. They may still be a constitutional monarchy, much like the UK, where the sovereign serves only a ceremonial head of state function, but the real power is in the hands of the people. Who knows how Dara will evolve, but that's leading the seed for that being the future. So, the point is the Grace of Kings and Dandelion Dynasty is really, it might be called the Dandelion Dynasty, but it's really about the ultimate abolishment of dynasties altogether. It's ultimately about the rise of true modernity, a constitutional monarchy, a sense of power belonging to the people. So when I hear people talk about epic fantasy being about the yearning for divine right of kings, it's ludicrous. I'm hardly the only one. Lots of us writing epic fantasy are trying to explore ideas about constitutionalism, about republics, about what does it mean to have power with the people.
Yeah. And the people of Dara, speaking of Ukitasa, the people of Dara has to learn so many things all the time, and especially learning how to cooperate with the people of the Ukyu on Gonde, which is their invaders. with
Mm-hmm.
the people of the Ukyu and Gonde was the invader of Dara, and yeah, the battle ended in the Wall of Storms. But in the Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones, they started to slowly they started to cooperate with each other. And do you find these writing sections on how they start to cooperate with each other, easy to read or difficult. Because from my perspective, usually when it comes to being invaded, epic fantasy usually always mean that we have to repel them, we have to defeat them, everything, no cooperation. So very rarely will there be any cooperation done between the two civilizations.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those really complicated questions, and I
Yeah.
don't really have an easy answer. And I will say that um, when I'm writing epic fantasy, I'm always concerned about the world we live in, not necessarily the world that never was. So the problems of Dara are really analogous to problems we face in the real world. I mean, in much of the real world, we're dealing with that very legacy. I mean, how are descendants of enslaved people supposed to live in peace with the descendants of their enslavers?
Yeah.
How are people who have been slaughtered by nomadic conquerors and who are the descendants of rape and mass genocidal policies supposed to now live with the descendants of the people who carried out those policies? But these are real things. These are not imagined scenarios. This is literally what is happening around the world. I mean, if you happen to live in a place where you don't have to deal with that, you are very lucky. And you likely belong to history's winners. You likely belong to one of those countries that did the conquering, rather than living in a country that was conquered and now have to deal with this legacy. So Dara is very much, a reflection of the real world. Many of the problems in there. So, for example, I talk about the so-called harmony tax, which is, a subsidy for encouraging people to mix together, to not have mono-ethnic enclaves. These are obviously based by people who know on policies that were enacted in Singapore and other places that have to deal with this sort of thing. It's many places are terrified of the perpetuation of historical grievances, and how do we move to a more collaborative, a more accommodating future without telling the descendants of victims just forget about it. I mean, that is not a solution, right? A lot of times people were just like, why do you have to remember? Why can't you move on? What happened 200 years ago? The reason is you're still enjoying the benefits of the terrible things your ancestors did 200 years ago. And I'm still suffering from the terrible things that happened to my ancestors 200 years ago. So no, we can't just forget about it. But how do we actually have true truth and reconciliation? How do we actually form a new story that accommodates everyone? This is a problem that every country in the world is dealing with, and we're all part of it. So I always say, history is incredibly important, because you can't understand why things are the way they are until you understand history. I mean, you cannot understand the history of contemporary America without understanding its original sin, without understanding enslavement, without understanding the Chinese Exclusion Acts, without understanding all the genocides and all the terrible things that happened along the way. And you have to understand it to understand why things are as difficult as it is. But also, I think in those stories, in that history, you can also see hope, because we do reconcile, we do get better, we do find ways to recognize that legacy. I mean, in the United States now, we recognize that it's not a good thing to celebrate Confederate generals. So those statues are coming down. In Dara, the descendants of the Liu are recognizing that those statues and those portraits commemorating the conquerors are perhaps not the part of the Liu heritage they want to preserve. That's why I wrote it in there. It's something that's very important. It's very much part of what we have to go through. And epic fantasy or not, these are problems that humans have to deal with.
So good. Just thinking about all of this again made me remember the experience of actually reading these books and absorbing all this information into my brain. It is just so good. And you gave plenty of spotlight to the children of the Dandelion Dynasty, to the characters, all of them, and you gave every one of them, I think, a balanced spotlight. And it's it's sad. It's sad when I get to see pretty much all of them go. Okay, except Farah and Terra. Even Terra moving to Ukigonde. That was a move
Yes.
that was a move that I totally didn't predict. Okay, especially after her being especially after her being named as the as sorry, what's the name? As Kunigaru's successor. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
But see, that's the thing. If she simply did that, she would just be the dutiful daughter carrying out her father's wishes. But that is not the path she wanted.
Yeah.
That's not interesting to her. She wanted to do the more interesting thing. That is why she had to go and do, you know, become a part of a different culture and live a whole different life that she never could have imagined as a little girl. And that's also part of modernity, to live a life you never could have imagined, and to do things that your parents never could have predicted for you.
Totally. She gave so much for the land of Ukyu and Konde. And uh when you wrote that, I forgot the actual passage here, but it was about a leaf coming back to its roots or something like that. Sorry, I forgot
Yeah,
about it.
yeah,
Yeah, but that one just it hurts. It was amazing, really. It was amazing to see her
yeah.
come back to the land of Dara. It was such an emotional moment. So good.
Thank you. Thank you. I really love that. And also, you know, just um um it's, you know, the Dandelion Dynasty is very much about what it means to journey through cultures, to create your own culture, to find your own family,
Yeah.
to become who you are. And I think, you know, it's important to me to sort of recognize that these are also very modern experiences. Um, Part of modernity is this sense of rootlessness and this
Mm.
search for new roots. We're all sort of, a lot of us really, who belong to the global knowledge working class, we are, you know, in a lot of ways separated from our roots. We go to colleges far from home. We end up jobs thousands of miles from home, a lot of
Yeah.
us, and we, even if we don't move physically, we end up living in cultural circles that were nothing like the circles we were born into. Just
Mm.
the nature of change, and it's so fast. You know, it's very easy to get a whiplash. But this sense of rootlessness, this sense of having to create your own roots and to find new connections, to find new stories to tie yourself into. You know, as an immigrant, I had to figure out how I can put myself into a new story. How do I tie myself into this new story? How do I now become part of the American chorus? How do I actually not merely say I'm a guest here, but to say I am actually a host here. I
Mm.
belong here, and now I am going to create part of the Constitution of America. My acts are constitutive acts, weighty as precedent. When
Mm.
we all have to learn to say that, and to feel like this is where we are and we now belong, we shape its story. So in some ways, right, Sarah's experience mirrors the experience of every immigrant. They start
Mm.
out as guests, and then they have
Mm.
to realize, no, we're not guests. We're not guests here. The gods of this land are my gods. The stories of this land are my stories. And
Mm.
I will add my story to these stories. I will add my voice to these voices. There will be people who will not like it that I'm here. I
Mm.
don't care. I belong as much as they do.
Yeah.
That's, you know, that's part of the modern story.
Yeah. And one of my favorite scenes is not only about Terra here in Veltron and Speaking Bones. I just consider them as one book now because after reading Speaking Bones, everything in Veltron made so much more sense to me. Even the cooking,
Thank you.
even the cooking competition. Okay.
Exactly, right. It
Yeah.
actually makes, so if you imagine the book were just one book, it would have made so much more sense because the
Yeah.
cooking competition happens in the middle and it sort of becomes the pivot point for everything that happens afterwards.
Yeah. Especially for Farah, right? Farah's development happened a lot
Yes,
because of that cooking competition. Yeah.
that's her constitutive story. That is the moment she became a prince, from a princess of Dara into actually one
Yeah.
of the member of the people of Dara,
Yeah.
and that is why she could be who she became later on.
Yeah. You also talk about bookmaking in Speaking Bones. It's too bad.
Yes,
It's really too bad that these two cannot be combined into one book.
I know. I wanted to. That was my original intention.
Yeah.
My contract was actually for only 3 books, so I sent the
Uh,
last book in, and my editor was like, "Well, we can't publish that. There's nothing we can do." And he was like, "Look." He was like, look at how thick it is. We can't make a book like that.
yeah.
It's just we cannot make a book like that cheap enough for you to sell it. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have to break it into 2 books.
It is probably the biggest if we count this as one, okay, and I'm counting this as one. This is the biggest fantasy novel that I've read. It is the biggest one.
Oh, thank you. But as you know, that happens to a lot of other novelists too. They write this one book, and then it's just too big to be published as such,
Yeah,
so they
yeah.
have to break it down the middle. So I'm in good company. I mean, good old Tolkien even had to go through that.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings was not meant as 3 books.
Oh my god, but it is hilarious. But I think it all works out for the best
Yeah,
with the technology that we have right now.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
And I'm really glad that technological advancement and invention is one of the best part of the Dandelion Dynasty. I love
Thank
how
you.
it's utilized, all of them, whether it's for war, whether it's for civilizations, like the art of bookmaking. And it is, yes, so good.
That was so much fun to come up with. I actually probably enjoyed. So I did a lot of research into bathtubs and solar bathtubs and so on. So as you know, one of the recurring jokes in the books is there's one inventor who's really obsessed with having good bath, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
he's
yeah,
always
yeah.
inventing new. So that was what that was about. I actually really enjoyed looking into the technology of eco-friendly hot bath. How would you do it? And
Ah.
so that was the whole thing.
See, this is the thing. This is the kind of thing that I love so much about the Dandelion Dynasty. It's not only about war, it's not only about conflicts, but there is still hope, peace, and then technologies. Like the advancements of technologies, the inventions, it paved the way for how the future will be shaped for our civilizations, right? And yeah, I'm just gonna say that I love this.
Thank you. Yeah, it was so fun to write. So I'm glad that you had fun reading it.
Yeah, and you also wrote one of the most probably emotional, and also it's it's not emotional in the way that it made me cry, but also like it they were so close to cooperating, if that makes sense. And I'm talking about Firo and Gia Matiza here, because Gia at the end of her confrontation with Firo, she started to see the potential of Firo's, and yeah.
But Gia's problem has always been that she can't trust people. She
Yeah,
believed that
yeah,
she's the smartest person in the room. She believed that no one else can see what she can see. And she just never learned to trust. I mean, that was her thing. If she had one weakness, is that she could never see the world the way Gin does, or Cooney does, or
yeah,
Pharaoh does. She just couldn't. She never could learn to see the world that way. And I don't blame her. When she went through experiences that
yeah,
taught her that she can't really trust people. She has to rely on herself. But that is the tragedy of it. Farah says this. Farah says that the tragedy is, Firo could have been so good, and we'll never
yeah,
know. We'll never
yeah,
know. And that's the sad part.
yes. That's why it hurts even more, because so much potential for this
Yeah,
character, and it cuts off
yeah,
so soon. But as you said, that's what happened in real life as well
yeah,
to real
yeah,
people. Yeah.
yeah.
So now I still have so many questions, but if I end up asking all the questions, we will just be sitting there.
We'll be here until tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Seriously, there is no end, because the Dandelion Dynasty, as I said, even though this is a 3 or 4 books long, it packs so many contents, and the story span generations. It span generations. It's not just
Yeah.
happening in 1 or 2 years. It's not something like that. And so I'm just going to ask the hardest question as my last question here. And what would be some of your favorite scenes to write? And I know this will be hard to answer, because there are so many pivotal and monumental scenes in the series.
Yeah, it is hard. I mean, I will say that the cooking competition is probably my favorite part. It's
Your passion really shined there, by the
yeah, I really
way.
I love cooking shows and I
Yeah.
love food. So you can imagine, I mean, writing those things was like, just utter blessed. It was so fun to write.
Yeah,
I every revision pass, I look forward to getting to the cooking competition because I'm like, oh, this will be fun, so fun. It was like probably the most effortless writing. It was, the Blossom Gang told me what to write, and I just did as they asked. It was so much fun to actually
Ah.
have them do it. Um, but outside of that, I think my favorite scene is probably in Speaking Bones.
Mm.
It's the scenes involving Zankara. So
Ah.
Zankara is a character who shows up for only a
Mm.
few chapters. She
Mm.
has very little screen time, but she's really one of my favorite characters because she's somebody who explicitly embodies that whole transition between orality and literacy. And she
Mm.
represents for me that whole thing that got me started on this, which is the translatedness of modernity, right? So remember,
Mm.
she is somebody who is from outside of
Yeah.
Dara, who fell in love with Dara because she came to Dara as a teenager and she just her formative years were in Dara. And so she completely absorbed Dara's values as her own, only to realize that in some ways they are never going to be her values because her stories
Mm.
could not be told in the words of Dara.
Mm.
She was from, so she represents for me this translatedness of modernity. And her dilemma was how to reinvent the language so that modernity no longer feels so translated. So her entire mission was to reinvent and invent a script, a literate culture for her own people to allow their experience to be transported into modernity, but on their own terms, not through a translated language. So, to me, that's sort of the task of all colonized peoples as we struggle through modernity and figure out how do we use the master's tools to break the master's house and construct our own house? How do we construct our own house using words that are secondhand? How do we
Mm.
feel at home in these concepts that are not native? How do we end up feeling like the modernity is ours as well as other people's? And that's Zankara's dilemma. And
Mm.
so I really feel very deeply about her situation and trying to go through um, what she had to do. So yeah, those were some of my favorite scenes because I really put a lot of my thoughts on this topic into it. What
Yeah.
Zankara had to go through reflects in a lot of ways my own reflections, academic reflections on this topic.
Yeah. And are you satisfied with the ending? Because you envisioned this ending for a decade now. And so would you say that you're satisfied with how everything turns out?
I'm satisfied with almost how everything turned out. I still, um, if there's one thing I regret a little bit, it's that I do wish I gave Princess Kikomi a better
Mm.
ending.
Mm.
I realized only too late that her story wasn't complete by the time she died.
Mm.
So that's why she recurs kind of like a ghost over and over
Mm.
again in subsequent books. People always refer to her and they
Yeah.
reinterpret her story. So if there's one regret, it's that I wanted to do a little bit more with her and I didn't get the chance to do it. It just didn't feel natural anymore after she was killed off in the first book. But if there's one thing I could fix, I would try to, if I could do it over again, I would
Yeah.
try to do a little more with her story. That's it.
Yeah. And I'm glad because the ending really stick with me. It sticks so much with me. Seriously though, thank you so much, Ken, for writing this series. It means a lot to me. It really means you mentioned, right, like how a book isn't fully completed until someone reading until us, until each particular reader read the book.
Absolutely.
and we, in a way, complete our own version of the Dandelion Dynasty.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I love that. I really love that because now I have my own version and other people have their own version and we can still talk about it. It's just,
Exactly.
yeah, so
And and
surreal.
and the fact that, for the longest time Dara was just me, and the only other person who knew Dara was Lisa, my wife.
Yeah,
But now there are readers who have come into Dara and who have found their own interesting path in it. That just makes me so happy. I hope all of you, Petrik, and every
yeah,
other reader who has read the Dandelion Dynasty will, find the most interesting path, walk on it, and tell your own story. Tell the story that you want to tell.
yeah. Thank you so much, really. And I think that's the end of today's conversation. We have talked about this almost 2 hours now. I think almost 2 hours. I don't know how long this is, but yeah, thank you so much, Ken Liu, for coming to this channel. It means a lot to me to be talking about the Dandelion Dynasty with you. It means a lot, seriously.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really, it's such an honor, such a joy to talk about it with you. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. And if you mentioned that you probably won't be writing another series like the Dandelion Dynasty, and I'm totally fine with that. But if anything you write, I will be reading any of them, whether it's short stories, standalone
Thank you.
novels, standalone. Oh, you can actually write standalone novels, you know.
I do plan on doing that at some point. I have a few really exciting short stories that are coming out soon. I can't wait to share
Ah.
them with readers. It's been a lot of fun going back to writing more short stories, because while I was working on the novels, I really didn't write as many short stories as I used to. But now that
Mhm.
I have the brain space to do it again, it's really being a lot of fun to write short stories. So can't wait to have some of them come out next year and share them with people.
Yeah, I look forward to all of them. I look forward to everything you
Thank
write,
you.
seriously. So yeah, I think that's it for today's conversation. For those of you who are watching this, I'm going to assume that you have completed your own version of the Dandelion Dynasty. I hope that you have enjoyed watching my conversation with Ken Liu here. So thank you so much, Ken, and I will talk to you again, hopefully soon.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Bye
All right.
bye.
Take care. Bye.